In the annals of military history, few encounters demonstrate the decisive power of heavy cavalry as dramatically as the Battle of Scyllaeum in 677 AD. This extraordinary engagement, fought on the plains of Asia Minor, witnessed a force of approximately 2,000 Byzantine Cataphracts, the empire's elite armored cavalry, utterly destroy an Arab army numbering around 30,000 horsemen. The staggering disparity in numbers makes this victory one of the most remarkable in medieval warfare, and its lessons continue to resonate through military scholarship today. To understand how such an improbable victory occurred, we must examine the unique characteristics of Byzantine cataphracts, the strategic context of the 7th century, the tactical brilliance of Byzantine commanders, and the fatal vulnerabilities of the Arab forces. This battle represents not merely a statistical anomaly, but rather the culmination of centuries of Roman military evolution, meeting a critical moment in the Arab expansion following the rise of Islam. The strategic context. Byzantium under siege. The 7th century marked one of the darkest periods in Byzantine history. The Eastern Roman Empire, which had survived the fall of Rome in the West, found itself beset on all sides. The catastrophic wars with Sassanid Persia had drained the empire's resources and manpower. Then, seemingly from nowhere, Arab armies united under the banner of Islam erupted from the Arabian Peninsula with devastating force. Within a single generation, the Arabs had conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and much of North Africa, provinces that had been Roman for centuries. The speed and ferocity of this expansion shocked the Byzantine world. Ancient cities like Damascus, Jerusalem, and Alexandria fell in rapid succession. The empire that had once controlled the entire Mediterranean basin now clung to Anatolia, the Balkans, and scattered holdings in Italy and North Africa. By the 670s, Arab forces had pushed deep into Asia Minor, threatening Constantinople itself. The Umayyad Caliphate, now the dominant power in the Middle East, sought to deliver the killing blow to Byzantium. Arab fleets besieged Constantinople multiple times, while land forces probed the empire's defenses, seeking weaknesses that would allow for a final, decisive invasion. It was against this backdrop of existential crisis that the Battle of Scyllaeum took place. The Arabs, emboldened by decades of nearly uninterrupted victory, had grown confident, perhaps overconfident, in their military superiority. They had defeated the Byzantines in numerous engagements, and their light cavalry tactics had proven effective against traditional Roman infantry formations. A force of 30,000 horsemen represented a major investment in the conquest of Anatolia, intended to sweep aside Byzantine resistance and open the road to the imperial capital. The Byzantine Cataphract, the ultimate heavy cavalryman. To comprehend the outcome of Scyllaeum, one must first understand the Byzantine Cataphract, arguably the most formidable heavy cavalryman of the medieval period. The cataphract represented the culmination of nearly a millennium of cavalry development, combining Hellenistic, Roman, and steppe influences into a uniquely effective mounted warrior. The term cataphract derives from the Greek kataphractos, meaning completely enclosed or armored. This description was entirely apt. A fully equipped cataphract was encased in armor from head to toe, as was his horse. The rider typically wore a combination of lamellar and scale armor, consisting of small iron or bronze plates laced together to provide both protection and flexibility. Over this, he might wear additional chain mail or solid plate elements protecting vital areas like the chest and shoulders. The cataphract's helmet was a work of art and engineering, often featuring a full face mask or aventail that protected the neck and lower face. His hands were covered in articulated gauntlets, and even his thighs and shins were protected by armored greaves. The total weight of a cataphract's personal armor could exceed 40 kilograms, Yet Byzantine metallurgy and armor design distributed this weight efficiently enough that a trained warrior could fight effectively for extended periods. The horse received similar attention. Byzantine cataphract mounts wore chamfrons to protect their faces, and their bodies were covered in scale or lamellar barding. This equine armor extended from the animal's head down to its chest and flanks, with some coverage for the hindquarters. A fully armored cataphract horse represented an enormous investment, not only in materials, but in the specialized breeding and training required to produce a mount capable of bearing such weight while remaining agile enough for combat. The primary weapon of the cataphract was the kontos, a lance approximately 3 to 4 meters in length. Unlike the lances of Western European knights, which were couched under the arm, the kontos was typically wielded with both hands, held overhead or at shoulder height. This technique, inherited from Sarmatian and Parthian cavalry traditions, allowed the cataphract to bring tremendous force to bear in the charge. The kontos could punch through shields, armor, and flesh with devastating effect, and its length allowed the cataphract to strike enemies before they could retaliate. Secondary weapons included a long sword, typically a spathion, and sometimes a mace or war hammer for close combat. Many cataphracts also carried bows, making them versatile warriors capable of engaging at multiple ranges. This combination of arms meant that a cataphract unit could shoot from distance, charge with lances, and then engage in sustained melee combat, a flexibility that few other cavalry types could match. But equipment alone does not make an elite warrior. Byzantine cataphracts were drawn primarily from the empire's military aristocracy. The themes, or provincial military districts, provided soldiers who held land in exchange for military service. These men trained from childhood in horsemanship and warfare. They could afford the expensive equipment required because they were landowners, and they maintained this equipment as a matter of family honor and military necessity. The training regimen was rigorous and comprehensive. Cataphracts practiced charging in formation, maintaining cohesion at the gallop, and executing complex maneuvers. They trained to fight as a unit, where coordination mattered more than individual prowess. Byzantine military manuals, such as the Strategikon attributed to Emperor Maurice, detailed elaborate tactical formations and emphasized discipline, timing, and mutual support. A cataphract charge was not a chaotic stampede, but a precisely coordinated hammer blow, delivered with devastating psychological and physical impact. The Arab Horsemen. Light cavalry excellence and limitations. The Arab forces that the cataphracts faced at Silaim represented a very different military tradition. Arab cavalry of the 7th century were light horsemen, descendants of the raiding traditions of the Arabian Peninsula. Their strength lay in mobility, harassment, and the ability to control vast territories with relatively small forces. The typical Arab cavalryman of this period rode a swift desert horse or camel, wore minimal armor, perhaps a leather jerkin or light mail shirt at most, and carried a straight sword, spear, and composite bow. Some warriors used javelins for hit-and-run attacks. The emphasis was on speed and endurance rather than protective equipment. These warriors could cover enormous distances, living off the land or carrying minimal supplies, appearing suddenly to raid enemy territory and disappearing before heavy forces could respond. This tactical approach had proven devastatingly effective against both the Sassanid Persians and the Byzantines in earlier campaigns. Arab armies would avoid pitched battles when possible, instead using their mobility to outflank enemy positions, cut supply lines, and wear down opponents through constant harassment. When they did fight pitched battles, they relied on swarming tactics, archery, and exploiting any break in enemy formations. The expansion of the caliphate had been built on these tactics. Arab commanders understood that their forces could not match Byzantine or Persian heavy infantry in direct combat, so they rarely tried. Instead, they used the vastness of the terrain, the harsh climate, and their superior mobility to isolate and defeat enemy forces piecemeal. Byzantine armies marching through Syria or Egypt found themselves harassed constantly, unable to bring their enemies to battle, slowly exhausted by the environment and endless skirmishing. However, this tactical doctrine had significant vulnerabilities that would be exposed at Silium. Light cavalry, while mobile and flexible, lacks staying power in sustained combat. The limited armor worn by Arab horsemen meant they were vulnerable to counterattacks, particularly from armored opponents. Their small horses, while swift and enduring, could not bear the weight of heavy armor or generate the momentum necessary for a devastating charge. Moreover, the very success of Arab expansion may have bred a dangerous complacency. After decades of victory, Arab commanders had come to expect Byzantine forces to fight defensively or to collapse under sustained pressure. They had rarely encountered Byzantine forces willing and able to take the tactical offensive with overwhelming force at a decisive point. The psychological advantage had shifted decisively toward the Arabs, and this confidence would prove costly. The armies converge. Setting the stage. The Arab force that assembled for the campaign into Asia Minor in 677 AD was substantial, approximately 30,000 horsemen by most historical accounts. This represented a major commitment by the Umayyad Caliphate, intended not merely for raiding, but for conquest. The army likely consisted of veterans from the Syrian and Mesopotamian campaigns, experienced warriors who had fought against both Byzantines and Persians. The Arab commander, whose name is unfortunately lost or unclear in the historical record, apparently intended to push deep into Byzantine territory, possibly targeting the theme of Opsikion, which guarded the approaches to Constantinople. Success would have opened the Anatolian heartland to invasion and potentially delivered a fatal blow to the already reeling Byzantine Empire. Byzantine intelligence, which had by this point developed sophisticated networks throughout Arab-controlled territory, learned of the invasion force and its approximate route. The Byzantine response was organized by the strategos, military governor, of one of the Anatolian themes, possibly Opsikion itself. Rather than attempting to match the Arabs in numbers, impossible given the empire's depleted resources, the Byzantine commander assembled a force of elite cataphracts, likely drawing from multiple themes. The force of 2,000 cataphracts represented an enormous concentration of Byzantine military power. Each warrior was a heavily armed aristocrat, and together they formed the core of the empire's striking power. This was not a force that could be easily replaced if lost, making the decision to commit them to battle a calculated risk of the highest order. The Byzantines understood their advantages and limitations clearly. They could not outmaneuver the Arabs or match their numbers. They could not pursue a fleeing enemy effectively. But if they could force a decisive engagement on favorable ground, the sheer shock power of a cataphract charge might overcome the numerical disparity. The battle unfolds. Tactical brilliance meets perfect execution. The plains near Silium, modern-day Selendi in Turkey, provided the terrain that would determine the battle's outcome. While historical accounts are frustratingly sparse on specific details, we can reconstruct the probable course of events based on Byzantine tactical doctrine, the capabilities of both forces, and the ultimate result. The Byzantine commander likely chose his ground carefully. He needed terrain that would favor a cavalry charge, relatively flat and firm, without obstacles that would break up his formation. He also needed to find a way to force the Arabs to accept battle rather than simply evading his heavy cavalry. This suggests he may have positioned his force to threaten something the Arabs could not abandon, perhaps their line of retreat, a supply base, or a key position that controlled access to Byzantine territory. The Arab commander, confident in his numerical superiority and accustomed to Byzantine defensive tactics, apparently decided to attack. From the Arab perspective, a force of 2,000 cavalry, however heavily armored, should not be able to withstand 30,000 horsemen. The Arabs likely planned to use their traditional tactics: surround the Byzantine force, pepper them with arrows from a safe distance, and wear them down until their formation broke. This was precisely the scenario the Byzantines had prepared for. As the Arab force advanced, probably in a loose formation appropriate for mobile warfare, the Byzantine Cataphracts maintained strict formation. Byzantine military doctrine emphasized the importance of close order, with riders knee-to-knee in ranks several deep. This formation required extensive training and discipline, but it transformed individual cavalrymen into an armored battering ram of terrifying power. The Byzantine commander likely organized his force into a wedge or rectangular formation, with the most experienced warriors in the front ranks and on the flanks. As the Arabs approached, attempting to envelop the Byzantine position, the Cataphracts prepared for their charge. Horses were brought to a walk, then a trot, allowing the formation to maintain cohesion. The convoy were leveled, creating a forest of lance points extending meters ahead of the formation. Then came the moment that would decide the battle. At the optimal distance, close enough to build devastating momentum, but far enough to allow the horses to accelerate, the Byzantine commander gave the order to charge. 2,000 armored warriors, mounted on armored horses, accelerated toward the Arab lines in perfect formation. The psychological impact of a cataphract charge cannot be overstated. The ground shook with the thunder of thousands of hooves. The sight of an armored wall advancing at speed, lances lowered, created terror in even veteran warriors. The Arab horsemen, mounted on lighter horses and wearing minimal armor, suddenly confronted the reality of heavy cavalry in the charge, and nothing in their experience had prepared them for it. The initial impact was catastrophic for the Arabs. The front ranks simply disintegrated, lances punched through bodies and horses alike. The momentum of the armored charge carried deep into the Arab formation, which lacked the cohesion to resist. Light cavalry, designed for mobility and skirmishing, could not stand against the focused mass of heavy cavalry in the charge. Horses panicked and bolted. Warriors were trampled, speared, or simply scattered. But a single charge, however devastating, could not destroy an army of 30,000. What followed demonstrated the tactical sophistication of the Byzantine force. Rather than becoming dispersed in pursuit, which would have allowed the Arabs to swarm isolated cataphracts, the Byzantine force maintained discipline. They reformed, probably into multiple smaller formations, and charged again and again. Byzantine tactical manuals emphasized exactly this approach: successive charges from different angles, never allowing the enemy to recover or reorganize. Each charge targeted sectors of the Arab army that still showed cohesion, breaking them apart methodically. The cataphracts used their armor advantage in melee combat between charges, their superior equipment allowing them to dominate individual encounters. The Arab force, despite its enormous numerical advantage, found itself unable to effectively respond. Their arrows, while numerous, could not penetrate cataphract armor at decisive ranges. Their light spears and swords could not match the reach and power of the contos in the charge or the spatheon in melee. Their mobility, normally their greatest advantage, became a liability as panicking units fled in different directions, preventing coordinated counterattacks. The battle likely lasted several hours, with the Byzantine force systematically destroying any Arab units that attempted to stand and routing those that tried to flee. The cataphracts' training and equipment allowed them to fight continuously, rotating warriors as fatigue set in, while the Arab army fragmented into scattered groups of fugitives. The aftermath. A victory of profound consequences. The casualties were staggering. While precise numbers are impossible to verify from medieval sources, accounts suggest the Arab army was virtually annihilated. Of the 30,000 horsemen who had entered Anatolia, only a fraction escaped to report the disaster. The Byzantine force, protected by their armor and maintaining formation throughout, suffered relatively light casualties, perhaps a few hundred at most. The immediate strategic impact was profound. The destruction of such a large Arab force represented not only a military defeat, but a psychological shock. The aura of Arab invincibility, carefully cultivated through decades of victory, was shattered. Byzantine morale, which had sunk to dangerous lows, suddenly surged. Recruitment improved, and the themes became more willing to commit forces to offensive operations. The broader consequences extended beyond the immediate military situation. The Battle of Selaim occurred during the same period as the first Arab siege of Constantinople, which ended in disaster for the Caliphate. Together, these defeats marked a turning point in the Arab-Byzantine wars. While the Arabs would continue to raid Byzantine territory for centuries, the era of rapid conquest had ended. Byzantium would not merely survive, but would eventually launch counteroffensives that would reclaim territory. The battle also validated Byzantine investment in heavy cavalry. The Cataphract tradition, which stretched back to Rome's eastern campaigns, had proven its worth against the new threat from Arabia. This encouraged further development of heavy cavalry tactics and equipment, influencing Byzantine military doctrine for centuries. The cataphract remained the backbone of Byzantine military power through the empire's revival in the 9th and 10th centuries. Lessons in military history. Why numbers don't always prevail. The Battle of Selaim offers enduring lessons about the nature of military power and the factors that determine victory. The numerical disparity, roughly 15-1, makes this battle an extreme case study in how quality can overcome quantity under specific conditions. First, equipment and technology matter profoundly. The cataphracts' armor provided protection that made them nearly impervious to Arab weapons, while allowing them to kill effectively. This asymmetry meant that individual combats were almost always won by the better-equipped warrior. When multiplied across thousands of encounters, this equipment advantage proved decisive. Second, training and discipline amplify equipment advantages. The cataphracts' ability to maintain formation while charging, to reform after impact, and to execute coordinated attacks made their equipment advantages operational. A disorganized mass of armored warriors would have been surrounded and worn down. The Byzantines' superior training transformed individual superiority into collective dominance. Third, tactical doctrine must match capabilities. The Byzantines did not try to match Arab mobility or fight the kind of war their enemies excelled at. Instead, they crafted a battle plan that maximized their advantages: armor, shock power, and discipline, while minimizing their disadvantages. The Arab commander, by contrast, apparently committed his force to a battle that negated his mobility advantage and played to Byzantine strengths. Fourth, morale and psychology play crucial roles. The terror inspired by the cataphract charge broke Arab cohesion before the physical casualties became overwhelming. Once the army's confidence broke, its numerical advantage became a liability as panic spread rapidly through the massive force. The Byzantines, fighting with their backs against the wall of national extinction, maintained their morale through discipline and confidence in their equipment and training. Finally, strategic context determines tactical options. The Byzantines could commit their elite cataphracts to this risky battle because the alternative, continued Arab penetration into Anatolia, threatened the empire's survival. The Arabs, having achieved so much through their mobile warfare tactics, had perhaps become inflexible, unable or unwilling to adapt when confronted with an enemy who refused to fight on their terms. The broader military evolution. Heavy cavalry's golden age Silium represented a moment in the longer evolution of cavalry warfare. For roughly 1,000 years, from the late Roman period through the medieval era, heavy cavalry dominated the battlefields of Europe and the Near East. The cataphract tradition, which Byzantium inherited and perfected, influenced military developments across Eurasia. The success of Byzantine cataphracts encouraged imitation. Arab and later Muslim armies developed their own heavy cavalry units, though they never abandoned the light cavalry that remained central to their doctrine. European knights, who would dominate medieval warfare, owed much to the cataphract tradition, mediated through Byzantine influence and parallel development. However, heavy cavalry's dominance was never absolute. It required specific conditions to be effective: relatively flat terrain, an enemy willing to accept battle, and sufficient resources to maintain expensive equipment and horses. Against fortifications, in broken terrain, or against disciplined infantry formations, heavy cavalry's advantages diminished. The evolution of infantry pike formations in the late medieval period, followed by gunpowder weapons, would eventually break heavy cavalry's supremacy. But in 677 AD, on the plains of Silium, the cataphract achieved the perfect expression of its potential. 2,000 armored warriors, through superior equipment, training, discipline, and tactical employment, destroyed an enemy force 15 times their number. The achievement stands as one of history's most remarkable military victories. Conclusion: the legacy of Silium. The Battle of Silium deserves recognition as one of history's decisive engagements. While not as famous as Thermopylae, Cannae, or Hastings, it determined the survival of the Byzantine Empire at a critical moment. Had those 30,000 Arab horsemen swept through Anatolia unopposed, Constantinople might have fallen decades or centuries earlier than it eventually did. The cultural, religious, and political consequences would have reshaped medieval and modern history. The battle also represents a masterpiece of military art, the deployment of the right force, at the right time, in the right manner to achieve decisive results against overwhelming odds. The Byzantine commander who led those 2,000 cataphracts demonstrated strategic wisdom in forcing battle, tactical brilliance in execution, and profound understanding of the capabilities and limitations of both his own force and his enemies. For military historians, Silium provides insights into the mechanics of shock cavalry, the importance of combined arms, and the complex factors that determine battlefield outcomes. For general audiences, it offers a dramatic narrative of courage, skill, and the triumph of preparation and discipline over numerical superiority. The cataphracts who fought that day, encased in armor, mounted on their powerful horses, charging repeatedly into an enemy force that should have overwhelmed them through sheer numbers, embodied the martial excellence that allowed Byzantium to survive for 8 more centuries after the Western Roman Empire had fallen. They proved that in warfare, as in so many human endeavors, quality and excellence can overcome quantity, that training and discipline can amplify individual courage, and that tactical brilliance can turn apparent weakness into decisive strength. The Arab expansion, which had seemed unstoppable, met an immovable object at Silium. The thundering charge of Byzantine cataphracts not only destroyed an army, but broke a momentum that had carried from Arabia to the gates of Constantinople. In the long struggle between Byzantium and the Caliphate, this victory stands as proof that even in civilization's darkest hours, military excellence and strategic wisdom can achieve the seemingly impossible, including the complete annihilation of an enemy force 15 times larger than one's own.